Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. The First Crusade. The year is 1095. Europe is a place of hunger, rivalry, and restless faith. Across its fractured kingdoms, peasants and lords alike live under the shadow of war and famine. And beyond the horizon, rumours travel of an Eastern Empire besieged, of holy places defiled, of enemies gathering strength. These whispers ignite passions in the hearts of men. But no one yet knows that these sparks will soon set the world ablaze in what would be called the First Crusade. It begins, as many great movements do, with a voice. In the autumn of that year, in a French town called Clermont, a towering figure rises before a sea of people, Pope Urban II. Draped in robes of white and crimson, his voice booming, his words charged with something that feels less like a sermon and more like a summons. He tells the crowd that their fellow Christians in the East are in peril, that the Byzantine Empire, once a bulwark of civilization, is collapsing beneath the pressure of Turkish armies, that the holy city of Jerusalem, cradle of Christ himself, lies in the grip of infidels who profane the sacred places of the faith. But his call is more than a lament, it is a rallying cry. Take up the cross, he urges, march to Jerusalem. Free it from the enemies of God. The air is thick with fervour. Men tear strips of cloth and stitch them into crosses, fastening them to their tunics, their cloaks, their shields. Their hearts thunder. They are told that those who die in this holy venture will be absolved of sin, their souls lifted straight into paradise. For medieval Europe, where death is a daily companion and the weight of guilt an unshakable burden, this is no small promise. They weep, they cheer, they shout the words that will echo across the centuries. Deus vult, God wills it. But this story is not only of kings and popes. It is also of common men and women swept into the tide of history. Imagine a young French peasant, calloused hands gripping a wooden spear, his belly often empty. He has never seen the Mediterranean, never dreamt of setting foot in lands where olives grow and camels walk. Yet he is told that by walking east, by marching beneath the sign of the cross, he can win not only salvation, but honour, land, and wealth. He looks to his wife, her eyes both fearful and proud, and he feels that he cannot stay behind, or picture a knight of Normandy, iron mail weighing heavy on his shoulders, sword at his hip. He has spent his life locked in petty wars against neighbouring lords, fighting for scraps of land that shift back and forth with each season's campaigns. The Crusade offers him something larger, not a border skirmish, but a holy war, not a feud for a manor, but a chance to carve out a kingdom beneath the sun of the East. Urban's words ripple outward, across France, the Rhineland, the Italian states, even into the cold kingdoms of the north. Messengers spread the news, priests thunder it from their pulpits, pilgrims whisper it in marketplaces, and soon Europe begins to stir. The first to answer are not kings, but preachers, wandering men aflame with zeal. Among them, Peter the Hermit. Small, wiry, unshaven, riding a donkey, he cuts a strange figure. Yet his voice holds an almost hypnotic force. In towns and villages he gathers crowds, raising aloft a wooden crucifix, his words dripping with passion. He tells of Christians slaughtered in the East, of women ravished, of churches desecrated, of the Holy Sepulchre itself smeared with filth. His eyes burn as he speaks, and the people listen. They do not ask for proof. They do not weigh the politics of Byzantium. They hear only that their brothers suffer, that Christendom bleeds, and that God calls them to act. By spring of 1096, thousands are on the move. Peasants, artisans, beggars, women, children. Entire families pack what little they own into carts, drag them eastward, and call themselves the army of God. This movement becomes known as the People's Crusade. It is not led by nobles, not disciplined by trained commanders. It is a tide of the desperate, the faithful, and the reckless. But faith alone does not feed mouths. As they march through Europe, these ragged columns strain the lands they pass. Villages are stripped bare. Fields are trampled. Tensions flare between crusaders and locals, even though they are fellow Christians. Some turn their zeal into violence against Jewish communities along the Rhine, believing themselves instruments of God's wrath. Thousands of Jews are killed, some murdered outright, others committing suicide rather than accepting forced baptism. Blood runs in Mainz, in Worms, in Cologne. The crusade, before it even leaves Europe, has already left societal wounds that will fester for generations, and the memory of these events will scar Ashkenazi Jewry for centuries to come. Still, the army of God march, crossing the Danube, stumbling through Hungary, clashing with locals, starving, bickering, but never stopping. And eventually they pour into the lands of Byzantium. For the Byzantine emperor Alexios Komnenos, their arrival is a mixed blessing. He had asked for help from the West, yes, but he had expected knights, disciplined contingents, perhaps a few thousand, to bolster his strained armies. Instead, he finds tens of thousands of untrained, undisciplined peasants flooding his empire. They are not soldiers. They are mouths to feed. They are trouble. Yet Alexios plays the game carefully. He feeds them, ferries them across the Bosporus into Asia Minor, and hopes that, in truth, the Turks will break them, sparing him the burden. And break them, the Turks do. In the summer heat of 1096, near a place called Civito, the People's Crusade meets the professional horsemen of the Seljuk Turks. It is no contest. Turkish cavalry, swift and disciplined, ride rings around the disorganized mob. Arrows whistle through the air, blackening the sky, thudding into flesh. Panic erupts. Peasants scatter, screams rising over the clash. Spears splinter, carts burn, bodies fall. It is a slaughter. When the dust settles, tens of thousands lie dead. A dream of holy war, drowned in blood and ash. Yet the crusade does not end here, for the nobles are coming. Behind the People's Crusade lies the true host, the princes and knights of Europe, gathering their banners, mustering their men. They are not driven only by faith, but by ambition. Among them, Raymond of Toulouse, old but respected, a lord of the south of France, bringing thousands of followers. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, tall, commanding, a knight whose sword is said to cleave mail and bone alike. He is joined by his brother Baldwin, hungry for power and lands of his own. Bohemond of Taranto, son of a Norman adventurer, cunning, broad-shouldered, with eyes always fixed on opportunity. And Count Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France himself, though his arrogance will soon outweigh his talents. Together they form the backbone of what history will call the Princes' Crusade. They march in separate columns, through the rivers and passes of Europe, converging slowly on Constantinople. Their armour gleams in the sun, their banners whip in the wind, crosses of red, white and gold. The thunder of their horses echoes across valleys. Behind them trail infantry, camp followers, cooks, smiths, priests, prostitutes. The crusade is not a single army, but a moving city, tens of thousands strong. The noble host of the crusade was bristling with arms both deadly and refined, an arsenal honed in the ceaseless wars of medieval Europe, now carried eastward to carve out kingdoms in the name of God. Foremost among these weapons was the knight's sword. Long, double-edged, of hardened steel, it measured close to 1 metre in length, balanced for both the cut and the thrust. To the untrained it was merely a blade, but to its master it was an extension of the arm, honed through years of practice on tilt-yard and battlefield. In a close press of men, the sword's weight could shear through padded gamisons or split a wooden shield with a single, brutal stroke. Its very presence, flashing in the sun, was a symbol of noble status, the badge of a warrior sworn to fight. At the knight's side hung a dagger, narrow, double-edged and pointed, used in the crush of combat where sword strokes were impossible. More than one desperate fight ended with the plunge of such a blade into the gaps of an enemy's armour. Their shields, kite-shaped and elongated, curved down to a point that covered knee as well as chest. Painted with crosses, lions or chevrons, each one bore the heraldry of its master, so that even in the chaos of battle a knight could be recognised. The curve of the shield was not mere decoration. It deflected arrows and spear thrusts away from the body, glancing them aside with a scrape of wood and iron. In the crush of cavalry charges, these shields locked together like a moving wall, bristling with colour and steel. The spear was the simplest, yet most versatile of weapons, an ash shaft tipped with iron, often twice the height of a man. In formation, lines of infantry braced their spears outward, a deadly hedge to meet oncoming horsemen. From horseback, a knight couched his spear beneath the arm, turning it into a lance capable of shattering on impact. The force of such a charge, man and horse thundering forward, lance tip aimed squarely at an enemy chest, was terrifying to behold. Some blows could drive clean through a man, pinning him screaming to the earth. Behind the mailed warriors came the bowmen, men of lesser rank, but no less vital. Their bows were short, made of yew or elm, powerful enough to drive an arrow through unarmoured flesh at 100 paces. Each arrow carried a narrow iron bodkin or a wider leaf-shaped head, designed either to pierce mail links or to cut deep wounds in unprotected flesh. The whistle of arrows, loosed in mass volleys, was a sound that turned bowstrings into instruments of dread, but it was the armour that truly defined a knight. Each man of noble blood clad himself in a hauberk of mail, thousands of interlinked iron rings, each riveted closed, woven together into a flexible coat of steel. A well-made hauberk reached to the knees, with split skirts for riding, and sometimes included long sleeves ending in mitten-like extensions to cover the hands. Over time, the rings darkened with rust and blood, but their protection was undeniable. Arrows might glance away. Blades might cut, but not always pierce. A mace might crush bones beneath the links, but the flesh might yet be saved from cutting steel. It was armour that gave confidence, the sense of invincibility that turned men into shock troops. Beneath the mail, a padded garment called a gambeson cushioned the body, absorbing the shock of blows. Without it, the weight of the rings alone would tear the shoulders raw. Over it, some nobles wore surcoats of linen or wool, embroidered in their colours, both to display their lineage and to shield the iron from the beating sun. Helmets crowned their heads, conical helms of steel, with nasal guards projecting down to shield the face. Some were plain, polished to a dull shine, while others gleamed silver bright in the sunlight, crested with feathers or painted designs. To look into the eyes of a mailed knight behind the slit of a helm was to stare into something both human and inhuman, an iron visage advancing without fear. The burden was immense. A hauberk could weigh 20 kilograms or more, the helmet another 5, the shield nearly as much. Add to this the sword, the spear, the dagger, the bow and quiver for those who carried them, and every knight was a walking fortress of steel and oak. Under the heat of the Levantine sun, it was a torment. Mail heated like an oven, pressing sweat into the eyes, scalding skin beneath. But this was the bargain they accepted, to be encased in pain so long as death was kept at bay. And then there were the horses. The Crusader knight was nothing without his steed. These were not the light, swift ponies of peasant riders, but great destriers, bred for war. Massive in the shoulder, strong in the chest, trained not to flee from the clash of men and steel, but to drive into it. Their hooves were weapons, their weight a battering ram. Knights spent fortunes to armour their steeds, mail drapes to cover the neck and flanks, heavy leather trappers, dyed in brilliant colours, tassels and banners fluttering from the bridles. A charge of armoured knights upon destriers was more than force, it was spectacle. The ground shook, dust billowed, the earth itself seemed to roar. To stand before such a charge required either madness or faith of equal measure. This was the arsenal of Christendom, carried eastward under the banner of the cross. Not only tools of war, but symbols of a culture where status, faith and violence were fused. Each ring of mail, each crest upon a shield, each polished blade was more than material. It was identity, pride, and the unyielding belief that God himself marched in their ranks. When they finally arrive at Constantinople, Alexios Komnenos greets them with guarded caution. Here are the knights he hoped for, but in numbers far greater than he imagined. They camp outside the city walls, sprawling across the plains, their fires a sea of sparks against the night. For Alexios, they are both allies and a threat. He knows their hunger for land. He knows the West has little love for Byzantium, but he needs them. The Turks press hard into Asia Minor. Without help, his empire may not survive. And so he plays his hand with care. He insists that the Crusader leaders swear oaths of fealty, promising to return to Byzantium any lands they capture that once belonged to the empire. Some agree reluctantly, others with suspicion. But they need his ships, his supplies, his gold, and so one by one they swear. Thus the stage is set. The People's Crusade lies dead in the dust. The Prince's Crusade stands ready, disciplined, armed, burning with zeal and ambition. The great march east has begun in earnest, and ahead of them lies Asia Minor, a land of harsh mountains, searing sun, and enemies who know the ground far better than they. The Crusaders crossed into Asia Minor in the spring of 1097, ferried by Byzantine ships across the narrow straits of the Bosporus. The waters shimmered blue beneath them, yet many stared eastward with trepidation. Behind them, Europe, their homes, their fields, their families. Ahead, a land strange and hostile. Asia Minor was no gentle pilgrimage. The mountains cut jagged against the sky. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the earth into a cracked, thirsty skin. The air shimmered with heat, the road dust clinging to armour, choking throats. Food was scarce, water scarcer still. This was a land built to break men. But waiting for them was their first great test, the city of Nicaea. Nicaea had once belonged to Byzantium, but was now in the hands of the Seljuk Turks. Its walls were thick, bristling with towers, encircled by a lake on one side and fortified earthworks on the others. Within, a determined garrison stood ready to resist. The Crusaders arrayed themselves around the city. Camps sprang up, banners fluttering in the hot wind, red crosses, golden lions, painted saints. Siege engines were dragged into place, wooden towers, battering rams, and great catapults, assembled from fresh-cut timber, the air filled with the thud of hammers and the creak of ropes. At dawn, the first assault began. Crusader knights charged forward, shields high as arrows rained down from the walls. The clang of iron on iron, the splinter of shafts into wood, the screams of wounded men, all rose into a terrible chorus. Men hurled stones the size of ox skulls from mangonels, the rocks smashing against battlements. Ladders scraped against stone, boots thundered up the rungs, and then cries of agony as boiling oil poured down, scalding flesh. One night, a follower of Godfrey staggered back from the wall, his shield smoking, his skin blistered red. His comrades dragged him to safety, whispering prayers, while the battle roared on. For weeks the siege ground on. The Crusaders tightened their grip, choking off supplies, tunnelling beneath the walls to weaken their foundations. The defenders fought back fiercely, loosing arrows until their quivers lay empty, hurling rocks until their arms ached, taunting their enemies with shouts and gestures from atop the towers. But behind the Crusaders, Byzantine ships crept across the lake, slipping into position. Emperor Alexios had ordered them there, an unheralded manoeuvre. And one morning, as the sun broke over the horizon, Nicaea's defenders awoke to see the lake swarming with Byzantine sails. Their last hope of resupply was gone. By June, Nicaea surrendered, not to the Crusaders, but to Alexios. The Byzantines raised their own banners above the walls, barring the Crusaders from plunder. The knights were furious. They had bled for this prize, only to see it claimed by an emperor they barely trusted. Yet Alexios, shrewd and calculating, showered them with gold and gifts, calming their rage for now. But Nicaea was only the beginning. Ahead lay the open fields of Asia Minor, and the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan was gathering his army. In late June, the Crusaders marched out, columns stretching for miles. Armoured knights at the front, infantry trudging in the heat, supply wagons creaking behind. Dust rose in clouds around them, clinging to sweat-soaked skin. Near the town of Dorylaeum, the Turks struck. It was July the 1st, 1097. At dawn, Godfrey and Bohemon's vanguard marched ahead, their column winding through a valley. Suddenly the horizon darkened. The ground trembled with the thunder of hooves. From every ridge, Turkish horsemen poured down, thousands of them swift as falcons, their horse bows raised. The air screamed with arrows, clouds of them whistling, hissing, biting into flesh and wood. Horses reared and screamed, men clutched at wounds, shields quivered under the impact. Panic rippled through the Crusader camp. Women and children shrieked, oxen bellowed, carts overturned. Bohemond roared orders, rallying his men. Shields locked into a wall, knights braced behind them, spears thrust outward. Yet the Turks were masters of mobility, darting close, loosing arrows, then wheeling away before a sword could reach them. The valley echoed with the clash of iron and the shrill cries of horses. For hours the Crusaders held, battered, bleeding. Men fell in the dust, their lifeblood soaking into the earth. Some whispered prayers, others cursed. A young knight from Lorraine, pierced by an arrow, cried out to his brother, "Tell my wife, tell her I fought," before he slumped lifeless to the ground. But then a horn sounded. From the west a new column of Crusaders appeared. Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey's brother Baldwin, and countless others. Their banners surged like a tide, their trumpets blaring. The Turks faltered. More horns, more shouts, more steel. The full Crusader host had arrived. From the ridges and valleys came the thunder of more hooves, the banners of Raymond, Baldwin, and the southern French snapping in the wind. Horns bellowed, trumpets split the air, and suddenly the battlefield, that had been a death trap for Bohemond's vanguard, was transformed into a killing ground for the Turks. Now it was the Turks' turn to reel. Their swift horse archers, so confident in encircling and peppering an isolated column, suddenly found themselves pressed on every side. Where their arrows had once thudded into shields or flesh, now they met a wall of steel and vengeance. The knights lowered their lances, ash shafts tipped with iron, heavy enough to punch clean through mail or shatter bone. The destriers beneath them, massive war horses bred for this single act, snorted and screamed, ears pinned back and square teeth bared as spurs dug deep. Then came the charge. The impact was catastrophic. Lances splintered with a crack like timber struck by lightning, their broken shards driven deep into flesh. Turkish riders were impaled clean through, flung backwards off their saddles, as their screams were lost in the roar. Horses collided chest to chest, the lighter Arabian and Turkoman horses, staggering, snapping legs, rolling together into tangled masses of kicking, dying beasts. The ground shook under the weight, dust rising in choking clouds, turning the noon sun into a blood-red haze. Behind the lances came the swords, broad-bladed arming swords hacked down with brutal precision, cleaving into helmets, splitting shields, sending gore spraying across the dirt. The air rang with the metallic thunder of steel on steel, the duller crunch of blade on bone, the shrill cries of men struck down. One Norman knight was seen carving a path straight through a knot of Turks, his sword strokes so heavy that each blow cut clean through arm and shield alike, leaving bodies sprawled in his wake. The Turks tried to wheel away, loosing arrows as they fled, but panic had already seized them. Their famed mobility collapsed in the press of armoured Crusader riders, thundering down on them, astride their powerful destriers. The combined weight of a Crusader knight and his war horse could be more than twice that of a Turkish light horse and rider, and the impact of the cavalry charge and collision was devastating. The kite shields of the Crusaders, painted in lions and crosses, smashed into their foes like battering rams. Iron-shod hooves stamped men into the earth, skulls splitting beneath the weight. A Seljuk captain, clad in lamella plates, tried to rally his horsemen only to be ridden down, his body disappearing beneath a wall of lances. Everywhere there was chaos. Arrows no longer flew in neat volleys, they snapped wild into the melee, striking friend as often as foe. Bows were dropped for scimitars, curved blades flashing desperately against mail-clad knights, who pressed inexorably forward. Sparks flew where steel glanced off steel, the clang and ring of it deafening, the dust, the blood, the screams. It became a storm in which men could barely tell where sky ended and earth began, and in that storm the Seljuks broke. Horses spun, riders fled, whole squadrons unravelled. The field that had been theirs at dawn was now littered with their dead and dying, the cries of the wounded mixing with the thunder of Crusader pursuit. Kilij Arslan himself saw the tide was irreversible. He turned his horse, spurring it hard, abandoning the field to save what he could of his shattered host. By afternoon, the plain of Dorylaeum belonged to the Crusaders. The grass was flattened and torn, strewn with broken lances, shattered shields, and the twisted forms of men and beasts alike. The stench of blood and dust clung to the air, thick and choking. But for the knights of Christendom, it was victory, a victory wrested from the very jaws of destruction. The victory came at a cost. The dead littered the ground, their bodies swelling in the summer heat, vultures circling overhead. The wounded groaned in agony, their cries carrying across the plain. Yet the Crusaders pressed on, their faith hardened, and the way eastward lay open. The march through Asia Minor was a crucible. The heat was merciless, beating down upon helmets until the iron burned against skin. Men tore off mail shirts just to breathe. Water was scarce, so scarce that soldiers fought each other at wells, blades drawn, desperate for a single mouthful. Horses collapsed, their tongues swollen, their flanks lathered with sweat. The stench of death lingered in the air, for carcasses lay unburied by the roadside, too many to move. Disease spread, dysentery, fevers, festering wounds. Some men coughed their lungs raw, others rotted alive from infected sores. Yet still they marched, each step a prayer, each mile a testament to endurance. By autumn, they reached the great city of Antioch. Antioch, a city vast and ancient, its walls towering high, studded with more than 400 towers, stretching miles around. Nestled between mountains and river, it was a gateway to the Holy Land. Whoever held Antioch controlled the road to Jerusalem. To the Crusaders, it seemed impossible, but impossible was a word they no longer recognized. The siege began in October 1097. The Crusaders encircled the city, their camps forming a ring of fire and steel. Yet Antioch was well provisioned, its defenders numerous. Weeks turned into months. Hunger gnawed. Winter set in. Snow fell on tents that offered little shelter, freezing men where they lay. Supplies dwindled. Food was rationed to crumbs. Horses, once proud steeds of war, were slaughtered for meat. Men gnawed on boiled leather, on grass, on roots torn from the frozen ground. A soldier of Provence wrote that they even ate the flesh of the dead. So desperate was their hunger. Inside the city, the defenders jeered from the walls, dangling bread, meat, and fruit on ropes, mocking the starving enemy. Arrows flew both ways, but morale was a weapon just as sharp. Yet the Crusaders endured. At times, relief armies tried to break them. In February 1098, a force of Turks swept down, their cavalry circling the camp. The Crusaders, gaunt and half-starved, strapped armour onto wasted frames and stumbled to meet them. The clash was desperate, brutal, but faith and fury carried the day. The relief army was driven back, Antioch still in their grip. By spring, disease had thinned their ranks. Corpses lay in heaps, the smell rank and unbearable. Yet still the crusade clung on, for they knew that if Antioch did not fall, neither would Jerusalem. At last, in June 1098, betrayal cracked the city open. A guard upon the walls, a Christian convert named Firouz, was bribed. One night, under cover of darkness, he opened a tower gate. Crusader knights slipped inside. Sword in hand, Bohemond of Taranto stormed through, his men cutting down guards as they rushed to the battlements. Gates were flung wide. The Crusaders poured in. Antioch fell in a storm of steel and fire. Streets ran red, houses burned, the cries of the dying filled the night. Crusaders seized food and treasure with wild abandon, feasting at last. But their triumph was short-lived. Within days, a vast Muslim army under Kaboga of Mosul descended upon Antioch. Now it was the Crusaders who found themselves besieged, trapped within the very city they had taken. Panic gripped them. They were starving, exhausted, wounded. The enemy outside was larger, fresher, better supplied. For many it seemed the end. But then, amidst despair, a vision. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received a divine revelation, that beneath the floor of a church lay the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side. Men dug furiously, their hands raw, their eyes wide. And when they pulled forth an ancient spearhead from the soil, the camp erupted in ecstasy. To modern ears it may sound like folly, but to men at the edge of despair it was proof of God's favour. With the lance before them, their courage surged like fire through dry tinder. On June 28th, 1098, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch to face Kaboga. They were skeletal, many barefoot, their armour patched, their swords nicked and dulled. But their banners flew high, and their voices rang out with hymns. Kaboga's cavalry thundered forward, confident of easy victory. Yet the Crusaders held firm, their infantry forming a wall of shields, their knights thundering out in disciplined charges. The Turkish lines wavered, fractured, broke. By sunset, Kaboga's army was in flight. Against all odds, Antioch remained in Crusader hands. By now, the Crusaders had endured 2 years of unimaginable hardship. They had marched across continents, fought in blistering heat and freezing snow, starved, bled, and burned. And still, they pressed onward. For beyond Antioch lay the final prize: Jerusalem. The road to Jerusalem stretched out before them, a land both sacred and cruel. By the winter of 1098, the Crusaders were shadows of the hosts that had once set out from Europe. Of the tens of thousands who had marched, barely half remained. Some had fallen in battle. Others had been claimed by disease, starvation, or exhaustion. Many had simply deserted, slipping away into the night, seeking safer lives far from the brutal path east. Yet those who endured pressed on. Their armour was battered, their swords nicked, their shields splintered. Horses were gaunt, ribs visible through their hides. The men themselves were skeletal, their eyes sunken, their bodies scarred by wounds and hardship, but their faith, or their stubborn will, was iron, and before them loomed the city of God. They marched south through Syria, a land of dust and stone, of fortified towns and wary locals. At every step they were harried by hunger. Fields had been stripped bare by armies before them. Villages barred their gates. At Ma'arat al-Numan, desperate and starving, the Crusaders stormed the city and slaughtered its inhabitants. Chroniclers would later whisper of even darker deeds, that in their hunger some boiled the flesh of the dead. Whether true or exaggerated, the story spread like wildfire, leaving behind a shadow that no holy banner could conceal. Still, the march did not falter. The dream of Jerusalem burned in their minds. Each mile brought them closer to the place where Christ had lived, died, and risen. By June 1099, after nearly 3 years of struggle, the Crusaders reached their destination: Jerusalem. It rose before them, a city crowned with walls and towers, golden in the sun. The dome of the rock glinted like fire upon the Temple Mount. To those who had trudged across continents, this sight was almost unbearable. Some fell to their knees and wept. Others lifted their arms skyward, voices breaking in hymns. A soldier from Normandy wrote that he could hardly breathe, so fierce was the swell of awe and longing. But Jerusalem was no passive prize. The Fatimid garrison held the city in strength. Its walls were high, its gates fortified, its defenders determined. The Crusaders, weakened and few, faced one last impossible trial. The siege began in June. The Crusaders encircled the city, digging trenches, raising wooden towers. Yet the sun was merciless, the land barren. Water had to be dragged for miles, skin by skin, under constant harassment from enemy patrols. Men fainted from thirst, their lips cracked and bleeding. Horses collapsed, never to rise. Food was scarce, so scarce that weeds and roots became precious meals. Inside Jerusalem, the defenders mocked them, hurling insults from the battlements. Arrows rained down, stones thundered, taunts echoed. Your God cannot save you. But still they worked. Timber was hauled from miles away, carpenters labouring day and night to fashion siege towers. Blacksmiths hammered nails, ropes were knotted, hides stretched across the frames to shield them from fire. Every blow of the hammer was a prayer, every stroke of the saw a vow. And then came the moment of fire. On the morning of July 14th, 1099, the Crusaders launched their assault. Siege towers, vast wooden beasts, rolled forward on creaking wheels. Archers swarmed their platforms, loosing volleys into the walls. Drums beat. Trumpets blared. The roar of men surged like thunder. Godfrey of Bouillon commanded the assault at the north wall. His tower loomed high, pushed by dozens of straining men. Arrows hissed from above, thudding into shields, flesh, wood. Defenders hurled down rocks, pots of burning pitch. Flames licked at the hides stretched over the tower, smoke billowing, men coughing, choking. But the Crusaders pressed on. Step by step, the tower rolled closer. Godfrey himself, tall and unyielding, stood at its summit, his sword gleaming. Crossbow bolts and arrows clattered around him, yet he did not flinch. At last, the tower bridged the wall. Crusaders surged across. A storm of steel broke upon the battlements. Blades flashed, shields splintered, men screamed as they fell. Godfrey's knights hacked and shoved, their swords biting deep, their boots slick with blood. By midday the wall was theirs. A breach had been opened. Jerusalem was no longer untouchable. What followed was carnage. The Crusaders poured into the city, and fury consumed them. For years they had starved, bled, and died on the road to this place. Now, in their eyes, vengeance and sanctity became one. They cut down every foe they found. Streets ran with blood. Mosques and synagogues became slaughterhouses. Chroniclers write that men waded ankle-deep in gore, that the cries of the dying rose to heaven. At the Temple Mount, hundreds were slain. In the narrow alleys, women and children fell beside soldiers. For 2 days, the city was a vision of horror. And yet, amid the carnage, the Crusaders found their triumph. On July 15th, 1099 AD, exhausted and weeping, they proceeded to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Their armour was stained with blood, their hands still trembling from slaughter, yet their voices rose in hymns. For them, it was victory ordained by God. The city of Christ was theirs. When the killing finally ceased, a new order emerged. Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen to rule, but he refused the title of king, declaring he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he became the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. The First Crusade had achieved what no one believed possible. From the fields of France to the gates of Jerusalem, they had carved a path of faith and fire across the world. A Latin kingdom was born, fragile yet proud, upon the soil of the Holy Land. The aftermath was complex. For the Muslim world, the fall of Jerusalem was a wound seared into memory, a call to vengeance that would echo for generations. For the Muslims of Jerusalem, the fall of the city in 1099 was nothing less than a nightmare. Families who had lived for generations within its walls were cut down without mercy. Chroniclers speak of men, women, and children slaughtered in the streets, their blood pooling in alleys that only days before had echoed with market cries and prayer. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, among the holiest sites in Islam, were seized and profaned by Crusader soldiers. For those who survived, exile or enslavement was the only choice. The shock reverberated across the Muslim world, not only for the sheer brutality of the massacre, but for the loss of a city regarded as the third holiest in Islam, after Mecca and Medina. The memory of 1099 burned into Muslim consciousness as a wound demanding vengeance, and in time it would help to forge the great counter-crusades of leaders like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and Saladin. For the Jewish communities of the city, deeply spiritually tied to the city that had once been the Jewish capital under King David, and that was the single most important city in Judaism, it was devastation. The Jewish inhabitants were not spared. Instead, they were herded into their synagogue and burned alive as the city fell. The Jewish community in Jerusalem were effectively wiped out in the massacre, perishing alongside Muslims. Jewish survivors in the wider region saw their already marginalised existence destabilised further, reinforcing a sense of exile and waiting for divine redemption. For the Byzantines, who had hoped merely for allies, the conquest represented the rise of rivals, planting their own banner upon lands once imperial, and for Europe it was a revelation. Knights who had once fought only for scraps of soil at home had carved out states in the east. Pilgrims who had dreamed of salvation had become conquerors. The Crusade proved that faith could mobilise nations, could carry men across the world, could shape empires. Yet it also revealed the cost, the blood, the cruelty, the contradictions. A holy war, yes, but also a tide of human suffering, a clash of civilizations whose aftershocks would reverberate through the centuries. In the end, the First Crusade was both triumph and tragedy. Triumph for those who knelt in the sepulchre and believed they had fulfilled God's will. Tragedy for those whose lives were consumed in the fire, Muslim, Jew, and Christian alike. And its legacy was only beginning, for the road to Jerusalem did not end in 1099. It stretched on through decades of wars, counter-crusades, and shifting kingdoms. The fires lit at Clermont, at Nicaea, at Antioch, and at Jerusalem would burn long after the last crusader sheathed his sword. When we look back, what do we see? We see men and women carried by faith so fierce it could move mountains, but also so blind it could burn cities. We see iron and fire, hunger and hope, cruelty and courage, woven together into one of history's most extraordinary marches. The First Crusade was not just a battle for Jerusalem, it was a battle for the soul of an age. And in its echoes we hear both the glory and the grief of humanity itself. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.